I'm going to tell you a story about the last pope to cross the globalists. And this is relevant, especially since over the weekend, President Trump took aim at Pope Leo in this rather lengthy Truth Social post. It's a whole rant about how Pope Leo has lost it, how he was probably elected out of nowhere just solely to counter President Trump's power. Now, rather than dissect this, I want to tell you this story about the last pope that took on the globalist. He was heart attacked after just 33 days in the papacy. Now, I don't say this to wish harm on Pope Leo. This is not an indictment of the church. This is not an endorsement of the church. On the contrary, I tell you this to underline the power of subversive forces inside world governments, religion, and secret societies. So again, this story is kind of like a Dan Brown novel, but it's true. It involves the CIA, the Freemasons, P2. Hold on, okay? If you don't know this story, I'm going to tell it to you, and I'm painting in broad strokes. This is Pope John Paul I. He was the last Italian pope for a reason. His real name was Albino Luciani. He was known as the smiling pope because he was constantly smiling, just like this. He was the Patriarch of Venice when he was elected to the papacy on August 26th, 1978, and he died under very mysterious circumstances just a month later, September 28th, 1978. Now, the Vatican refused an autopsy and rushed to embalm the body. Now, while he had a funeral procession in the Vatican, Italians who came to pay their respects were sobbing and yelling, "Who did this to you? Who murdered you?" Meaning the populace knew. They suspected foul play all along, but the Vatican rushed in Pope John Paul II and never gave answers. So back to the smiling pope. He did not want to be pope. I know they all say this, but if you read his writings to his close friends and family, he really didn't. In fact, he drove himself to the conclave in an old beat up car and was like, I need to get the engine fixed so I can get right back to Venice. He thought he was just one and done. He left all his stuff behind. He did not campaign for the papacy, and yet he won. Now, he was not known to seek power, but he had a deep disdain for corruption. He opposed Vatican II. He was disgusted by the money-making endeavors of the Vatican. As Patriarch of Venice, he was deeply affected by the scandal of the Banco Ambrosiano, which you're just gonna have to believe me that it's a scandal for time's sake, and then you can look into this separately, but the bank was closely tied to the Vatican Bank. When it failed, many people in his diocese lost their savings. He saw firsthand how church-linked institutional power and money grabs could harm the faithful. Now, after a month as pope, he was set to clean house and dismiss the people he believed were connected to the banking cabal, including, now these are two people you need to remember, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus and also Cardinal Villot. He was the Vatican Secretary of State. Both of them were connected to this banking scandal. They were also both Freemasons, which was another subset of the church that Luciani was against. And in fact, the official position of the church was that Freemasons be excommunicated. But the Pope had found evidence that both the Freemasons and P2 were operating inside the church, and he was against it. What those are fraternal networks that operate in secrecy. So they're basically what we call today globalist elites. They subvert institutional will to their will. They're elites, basically. Both have ties to the CIA. So the story goes that after a few weeks in office, the Pope drafts a list of higher-ups in the church who he would like to resign or replace. One of them was Chicago Cardinal John Cody. He was a famous scamster who was in charge of the church in Chicago. Previous popes had failed to get rid of him despite mountains of corruption and evidence of corruption. And in fact, he was under investigation by the U.S. government. He also told Cardinal Villot to his face that he intended to replace him. Again, he was the Secretary of State, and his notes were set to replace Bishop Marcinkus, those two men I told you about, president of the Vatican Bank. So Wednesday night, September 27th, he has a 2-hour meeting with Cardinal Villot. He explains all the changes he's about to make. He shows him a handwritten list. He goes to dinner at 8 o'clock. He goes and has a phone call at 8:45, and then he finishes up a speech, goes to bed around 9:30 p.m. at night. Now, the Pope's habit was to get up every day around 4:30 a.m. and then meditate between 5 and 7 a.m. He was always awakened by Sister Vincenza. It's a woman who had worked for him for almost 20 years. She always brought him his first flask of coffee at around 4:30, and then he would say, "Okay, good morning, thank you." He would get it outside the door. Now, that morning, she did, in fact, knock on the door, bring the coffee. Nothing happened. She noticed the lights inside the room were open, but the coffee sat there getting cold, and she thought, that's strange. Finally, she knocks on the door and says, "Are you okay?" She finds him sitting upright, lights on. He's wearing his glasses, gripping a sheet of paper, and his head is turned, and his lips are parted, showing his teeth, not like a smile, but like agony, like pain. She calls for help. A few men come in, one of the first being Cardinal Villot, who had just been fired. He enters the room at 5 a.m. He walks over to the Pope, takes the paper he's holding, the glasses, a medicine for low blood pressure, which was on the desk next to him, the bedside table, his slippers, and then he begins making phone calls. Now, those pieces of evidence were never found again. He comes in, takes evidence, and then tells Sister Vincenza, "Don't tell anybody this," and then starts making phone calls. Oddly enough, as news begins to spread of the Pope's death, a Vatican bank official reports to seeing Bishop Marcinkus in the courtyard of the Vatican at 6:45 a.m. Now, this is weird because he did not live there. He lived 20 miles away, was not usually in the Vatican in the early morning hours. Why would he be there when no one expected the Pope to die? Why on this Thursday he happened to be there? Also odd is the fact that the embalmer's car arrives at the Vatican at 5 a.m. Now, remember what I told you. The body's not found until 5:45. Cardinal Villot doesn't walk into the room until 5 a.m. How is it that the car arrives at the same time the body is being found, the embalmer's car? That's weird, right? These two brothers who were famous embalmers of popes, they're called the Signoracci brothers. They swear that they had got a call in the early dawn morning hours and that they drove there in their car, arriving at 5, the same time the body's found. Now the Vatican starts to put out these contradictory statements. One of them that he was found reading a book that he loved called The Imitation of Christ. Now the problem is, he loved this book so much, but his personal copy he had left in Venice. He had actually just borrowed a copy from someone and returned it. So he didn't have his personal copy. So all kinds of inconsistencies like this start popping up. Now, the Vatican refuses an autopsy, saying that's against Vatican law, which is not true. Other popes have had autopsies. They rushed to embalm him so that an autopsy would be difficult. And look at this account from the book In God's Name of the Embalming Process. Journalist David Yallop. This is a fantastic book if you want to know more about the banking cabal and the different inconsistencies. But he reports that at the Vatican's insistence, no blood was drained from the body, neither were any organs removed, and in fact, the embalming took 3 hours because the Vatican was adamant that no blood be drawn from the body. Even a small quantity of blood would have been more than sufficient to establish the presence of any poisonous substance, and yet they specifically refused. No blood. Then they turned to the media, who was complicit in their cover-up. The press starts to tell these crazy stories. The Pope had a history of illness. That was not true. His own doctor was shocked when he heard about this. They make up stories about how he was found, about this crazy story about smashing the papal ring, and in fact, he was Pope for too short of a time to even have a ring. Now, the autopsy, the outcry for an autopsy grows so loud that the Vatican eventually does perform sort of a scam of one. On October 3rd, a group of doctors show up at the site of the body. They put up large screens. They kick out the Swiss guards, and they just stay there for 90 minutes. And then they told the press, actually, that wasn't a full investigation. We were only there for 20 minutes, and we were just checking the embalming, even though they did not bring in the Signoracci brothers to check that embalming. Now, there are, again, other major red flags, links to the mob. It can be linked to Michelle Sindona, who was in jail in the U.S. at the time, but I think or under indictment at least. I think you get the picture. The Vatican did weather this controversy, and part of the way they did that was by rushing in the election of Pope John Paul II. The press turned their attention then to him as the first Polish pope. He was charismatic, and I would you say he was widely beloved, Pope John Paul II?
Oh, yes.
Yes. And so...
He would get crowds, all over the world.
Right.
Yeah, people, he would, get inside the Pope Mobile and millions of people would line the streets to see, yes.
Okay, but under his leadership, the Vatican bank scandal and other scandals did not, in fact, disappear. They only deepened. During his period, the bank became entangled in the collapse of the Banco Ambrosiano. The chairman, Robert Calvi, was found dead under mysterious circumstances in London. Archbishop Marcinkus, he was a Chicago native too, was implicated through offshore entities, very questionable financial dealings. And again, rather than expose this network, the Vatican moved to contain the damage, denied legal responsibility, but did in fact pay out millions in settlements to Ambrosiano creditors. And it was a massive theft from the Italian people. It crashed the lira. It created massive hardship throughout Italy at the time. Marcinkus was never prosecuted. He was shielded by the Vatican and Pope John Paul II. Archbishop John Cody of Chicago, he would, in fact, face U.S. investigations for financial misconduct, but Pope John Paul II kept him in power too. And in fact, he was alleged to have funneled money to the Vatican through Poland. And it is widely reported that when Pope John Paul II visited him in Chicago in 1979, he met him at the airport with a big box that he said was a personal present filled with $50,000. So the result was not the clean break from corruption that Luciani had been concerned about, but in fact, it was a period that was managed, absorbed, and allowed to persist. So you see the inconsistencies. Here comes a pope that's ready to fight the globalist and clean house, and he's dead in 30 days. His successor, totally fine, looks the other way. Does this remind you of anybody? The story of anybody? Anybody? I'm thinking of JFK Jr. Or JFK, who, had plans to fight corruption. And
RFK?
Yes.
As Attorney General, and who was actively going after these people and the Mafia specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in sum, this is a decades-old conspiracy with clear implications for the deep state. Now, am I saying that Pope Leo is a deep state hunter, like Pope John Paul I was said to be? I'm not prepared to say that, but it is clear that the Pope has opposed the war and other tenets that the deep state clearly wants. The Pope has opposed territorial expansion. The Pope has opposed bombing civilian sites like hospitals and schools. The Pope is against, for instance, he spoke out recently in a speech in January, spoken out about the silencing of dissent. In this speech, he said that freedom of speech depends on truth, but in the West, language is being manipulated in ways that actually shrink real freedom while enforcing ideological conformity. Here he warns that this leads to restrictions on conscience and emphasizes that refusing to comply with immoral demands, he calls it conscientious objection, is a moral duty. Now, of course, these are things the U.S. government does not like. If people are listening to the Pope, this is a clear problem for the U.S. government, which may be why President Trump is now presenting himself as an alternative religious leader in this Truth Social post he posted over the weekend, although he has since deleted it because the backlash has been so fierce. It may also be why it's being reported that the Pentagon allegedly told Vatican leaders to get in line, according to the Free Press. In a January meeting, U.S. officials told the Vatican, America can do whatever it wants, and the church had better get in line. Now, again, I want to be clear so we can all draw our own conclusions. Do I think the Catholic Church is a savior from the Epstein warring class? I don't know. I'm not an expert in Catholicism. This is, again, neither an indictment of the church or a defense of the church. But what I do know is this. When institutions speak against war expansion, coercion of conscience, they become inconvenient to power. And when they become inconvenient, they are challenged, undermined, and reframed. And that is happening right now. So the question isn't whether the church is right. The question is, why is it being positioned as an adversary?
Yeah, it's fascinating. And to your J.D. Vance question earlier, is that what will his response be in all of this as a
Catholic?
As a Catholic.
Right.
And other Catholics that are in the Trump administration, like, are they openly allowing this? And I mean, it's very fascinating right now.
Yeah. So let us know what you think of that. If you knew this story, if you knew a lot of these inconsistencies, like I said, to me, it reads like a Dan Brown novel, and the Vatican has never advocated for giving the public true answers.
Yeah, no autopsy. They come in, they grab his glasses, grab his slippers, like grab all of his personal effects. No
being
blood
drawn, quick embalming.
His friend shows up at like 5 a.m., never comes there that early. Like, what is this guy doing here at this time? Right, the
embalming car. I mean, there's more. I'm giving you, again, broad strokes, and all of this is verified. So again, let me know what you think.
Fascinating.